So welcome everyone to our last event of 2025, which is all about diplomacy on a global stage. And we have a group of 4 really fantastic speakers for you. Asmeret, Asefaw, Berhe, Megan O'Donnell, Adriana Mbandi, and Ritvika Sengupta from a whole range of organizations across the world who all have experience with navigating diplomacy. And we're really excited to have all of you in the audience today too. So a bit about what to expect at today's event. So we'll have a short welcome and announcements which we're doing right now, followed by our panelists introducing themselves, a panel discussion and Q&A, breakout rooms where you'll be able to meet our panelists individually. So you'll be able to go between breakout rooms and say hi to them. And then we'll close the event at 6 p.m. UTC. If you have any questions or tech issues, please send them through to me. So questions at ESWN. A bit of housekeeping. So please remember to abide by ESWN's code of conduct. If you've somehow found yourself here without having signed up, please take a moment to go to our website and have a look. All aspects of this event, except for the breakout rooms, are being recorded for those who can't join us live. This event is fully closed captioned, and you can use the CC button at the bottom of your screen to show or hide these. So if you hide the captions for you, it will only hide them for yourself and not for the whole meeting. If you have any questions, send them through to questions@ESWN. Remember to share your thoughts in the chat as the event progresses. It's always great to hear what you're thinking. And if you have any tech issues, please also send those through to the questions posted through the chat. A bit about the Earth Science Women's Network, if you haven't come across this before. So ESWN is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing diversity across the geosciences, with an emphasis on creating and supporting a nurturing community, working for cultural change to eliminate barriers to a diverse scientific workforce, and empowering scientists through professional development. And it's led by a volunteer board and associate board of directors, all of whom are volunteers and some of whom are here today. So why did we choose to host this event? So we know that there's lots of stressors within the earth sciences community right now, and a key concern is how to communicate and undertake advocacy for science safely during the current geopolitical climate. We'd also like to help you navigate challenging conversations and feel confident in applying diplomacy skills day to day, and also to provide reassurance and support to all of you here. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker and panel. So we have Asmeret Asefaw Berhe from the University of California and Merced in the US, Megan O'Donnell from the Geological Society in the United Kingdom, and Adriana Mbandi from the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel of the Global Environment Facility, also in the US, and Ritvika Sengupta from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development and the British Standards Institution, also in the UK. And I'm now going to hand over to our panel to introduce themselves, starting with Asmeret.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for the organizers for inviting us to this exciting conversation. Good morning, everyone. I think it's morning in most places. I assume where you are, but if you're in other time zones, good afternoon. I'm Asmeret Asefaw Berhe. I'm a soil biogeochemist and professor at the University of California, Merced. It's always a pleasure, I should start by saying, to engage with the ESWN community. I've been a member of ESWN since I was a graduate student and was honored to serve in the leadership board for several years too. So always excited to come back home and meet new folks and folks who've been part of the community for a long time. I should say that my latest and particular experience in science diplomacy was when I served in the federal government. I served as the director of the Department of Energy's Office of Science, the nation's largest supporter of basic research in the physical sciences during the Biden administration, and in that role, science diplomacy was an important part of the work. I led multiple US delegations in international negotiations, signing and kind of negotiating and then later signing bilateral and multilateral agreements with other nations, having to do with science in particular, and work to build scientific partnerships that advance many aspects of the work, the kind of work that folks in ESWN do, and just work really hard to strengthen international relationships so that scientists can pursue, kind of the science work that they do, that they want to do in with the ambitious and agendas that we all would like to pursue science. And even before my role in the federal government, and throughout my career, really, though, I've been deeply engaged in international scientific collaborations, working across borders to understand questions around soil, carbon cycle, climate change related topics. I mean, as all of you here would appreciate, obviously, these science questions, like many topics in environmental science, don't really care about political boundaries. And so it becomes important to think about the system that we care about and how best to study it. Um, and so I've always engaged in international collaborations and work. I'm also an immigrant to this country, originally from Eritrea in East Africa. And that perspective has also shaped how I think about building partnerships, in particular, making sure we're building equitable partnerships when it comes to science and ensuring that diverse voices are represented and heard in all sorts of kind of diplomacy spaces, if you will. And I'm happy to join everybody in this wonderful panel to share our experiences and talk about science diplomacy today. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Asmeret. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan O'Donnell, and I'm here today on behalf of or representing the Geological Society, which is a professional membership organisation based in the UK, but with members all around the world, actually. And I originally trained as a geologist and have been aware of the Earth Science Women's Network ever since then, and have been admiring from afar, I guess, quite a lot of the work that the network has done to create community and also to serve its members' needs. And I think that it's really exciting to be part of this event today, to talk about something I don't usually get to talk very much about in my work, but I'm sort of faced with very often, which is science diplomacy. So I originally did a geology degree, and then I went on to do a geology PhD. And my research focus was all about risk and environmental impact. And that was a very politically hot topic at the time. So it was particularly in relation to shale gas operations, which in that period of time when I was studying that in the UK was politically very sensitive. And that led me to develop a bit of an interest in how scientific evidence is used in policymaking. And so within my role at the Geological Society, where I've been since 2019, I both kind of research, but also look to develop better ways of practice for earth scientists to support them being our members or the wider geological community, wherever they are, to engage with people making decisions about public policy that might need evidence in some way. Now, evidence and science aren't necessarily the same thing. And earth science or science is just one element of the evidence that needs to be considered when, policies are being made. And so I would say that one of the things I've learned over the course of my time with the society and working in the sort of science and policy space is that the thing that I spend all my time thinking about is just a fraction of the thing that everybody that I'm working with needs to care about. And finding a balance is one of those very interesting diplomatic skills that I think it would be really kind of exciting to explore today in the context of the conversations and themes that you're looking to explore. As Asmeret mentioned, science and scientific challenges and solutions are global. They don't have borders. Some of the biggest challenges facing us today don't really care what country we're from or what the policies are in the location that we are, and the environments that we're living in are affected regardless of necessarily our geography. And so I think particularly within earth science, there is a huge opportunity to better leverage science diplomacy to ensure that I guess, policies and also decisions made by people in positions of power are led by and informed by the best available evidence, whether that be earth science evidence or earth science evidence, in my view, in combination with lots of other evidence and information that can kind of lead towards an idealized or a best outcome for the population.
Thanks so much. I'm Ritvika Sengupta. It's really great to be here with you all today. So I currently work at the British Standards Institution, BSI, which is UK's government recognised standards body. And as part of my work, I'm also seconded part-time to the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a multilateral organization bringing together member countries around the world. My background is also in climate science, so I did a geology undergraduate, really enjoyed that, and went on to do a PhD focused on environmental research. Specifically, I was looking at reconstructing past climates from the Cretaceous period. And then I did a wild 180 turn and went straight into essentially policy making. So I worked for about a year in the UK Research Institute, the UKRI, UK's research grant body. Working again on actually grants focused on energy and renewable energy specifically. I then moved into the civil service within UK government, working again on renewable energy, focusing specifically on the sustainability of biomass, before coming onto my current role today in the British Standards Institution, where I look at how standards and regulation interact and could potentially create better governance pathways for the climate solutions we're looking at. So how do we use regulation better, use policy better to deliver the climate solutions and the trust in the climate solutions that we're looking at? That's also where I engage with the OECD. I've been working on a project they have looking at how standards can support better regulation around the world across multiple global policy challenges. So I actually, in the policy space, I often work with people who aren't scientists, which is quite interesting. Although I work on climate policy, increasingly my focus is becoming more and more on kind of how good policy is developed, how good regulation is developed, and the answers to those questions are, of course, relevant to earth sciences and climate change, but also to many of the other kind of policy challenges that interact with those issues. And I think the biggest takeaway for me has been that, science diplomacy is something we do like every day. You'll all be doing it all the time. It's not just about the conversations people have at COP. It's, you trying to convince your next door neighbor or your family. And I really believe that there's a really important perspective that earth scientists have and people trained in earth science have that's really actually really trains us to think long term, which is not always an easy skill to pick up as human beings. So I think that's a real strength of people who work in the earth science space that we really need to kind of mobilize and leverage going forward, because it gives us that unique perspective to really solve the policy challenges of today. I'll pass back to the moderators. Thank you.
So good morning, good afternoon, and maybe good evening for some of you. My name is Andrea Nambandi, and I can confidently say I'm in such great company with the panelists. Just listening through their bios is really inspiring, and it really starts to cover this full, facet of policy and diplomacy, as it were. So I came to earth sciences in a roundabout way, I guess, like a lot of the panelists here. I am actually trained as a chemical engineer, and I I was meant to go into oil and gas and mining like everyone else because I did this in South Africa and I didn't. And for many reasons that I'll introduce later, perhaps in the panel discussion. But currently I work at the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. It's a mouthful. The Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel is the advisory panel of the Global Environment Facility. So we are hosted at the United Nations Environment Program here in North America in Washington, D.C. And just to give you a snapshot, the Global Environment Facility is actually a family of funds that consolidates different funding for the environment. And that can be the whole span of environment from looking at biodiversity, chemicals and waste, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, international waters, land degradation. In that whole slew of environment, I lead the portfolio for chemicals and waste and climate change mitigation, which is quite a big portfolio, covering more than what half of the portfolio of the GEF, of the Global Environment Facility. So how did a chemical engineer end up at the Global Environment Facility in Washington, D.C. in America? Well, actually originally from Kenya, where I went to school for most of my formative primary and high school. And on completing high school, I ended up in South Africa, where I accidentally ended up in chemical engineering because I wanted to be a doctor, a medical doctor. Like a lot of us who are scientific oriented, your parents would maybe want you to be a doctor because it looks like the most productive way to contribute to the community. But in the end, I ended up with chemical engineering. So I studied and worked in South Africa for a number of years, working in the electromechanical engineering world, looking at design and emissions. And then found my way into research again, because research is a common thread that I find through my life that leads me into a lot of these places. And at some point in South Africa, I decided I wanted to do my PhD, and I did my PhD with the Stockholm Environment Institute at University of York in the UK, where I actually got introduced to science and policy, because that is a think tank that translates science into policy and action. And in that I did, that's how I got introduced to atmospheric science through climate emissions modeling and looking at impact and scenario through policy. So I'll stop here and leave the rest for later. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Karine Ardern-Dreyer. I'm co-chairing the event with Raymond, and I'm very honored to be here today to do our panel discussion. Actually, this is probably my last ESWN event. So after 4.5 years, I'm stepping down with great sorrow, but again, with great honor to be able to serve the community. All right, so we're gonna go right away into our panel. We got questions from you all, the attendee and those who registered to the event and we combined them into different teams. And we're going to go over those teams in a second. We're going to have at least 2 panelists who will provide their feedback and their information on the team, and then we'll open it for other of our panelists. So our first team, which Remat's going to put in the chat if it's not already there, what does science diplomacy really means? How does communicating science intervene? And we're going to have Megan and Asmeret to answer these questions. Megan, would you like to go first?
Sure, I can do. That would be nice. Well, I think the definition is not universally agreed. So that's important to start with, which might seem like an unhelpful beginning point, but depending on what you are using diplomacy for and the context that you're referring to science in, it can mean very different things to different people. And I think that recognizing that not everybody means the same thing when they say science diplomacy is quite a useful starting point for communication. So if we sort of put that to one side and agree that it's not necessarily agreed everywhere, you can start by thinking about what the word diplomacy means. And diplomacy is essentially sort of the pursuit of a global interest. And I guess sometimes that can be by international organizations, but sometimes, as Ritvika mentioned, it can be in conversation with your neighbor. And the scale of science diplomacy also maybe slightly changes the meaning, because the scale is either funded, unfunded, or team-led or individualistic, or it can be for science or about science. So one thing I wanted to point out is that there's usually a quite helpful differentiation made between diplomacy for science and science used in diplomacy. There are lots of other types of science diplomacy out there, but to separate the two out, you might think of diplomatic action for science as actions or projects or organizational kind of changes or directions that are made to facilitate scientific action and cooperation. So they are almost like international policies or agreements that are in place to further science, if you like. Whereas where science might input into diplomacy, or you might think of science in diplomacy, on the other kind of hand, is where scientific evidence or information might inform policy objectives. So diplomatic actions or scientific advice might change or influence the way that foreign policy is made. And those two things require quite different organizations. They require different understanding of policy context, different connections and networks. And it's actually quite unusual for any one person to necessarily be involved in both. Usually, you would maybe be funneled into one or the other by either your work or your interest or your field of expertise. And so there's, I think, takeaway, science diplomacy is many things to many people, and it can be something very specific to you. There's lots of opportunities to engage in science diplomacy at varying scales, depending on what your interests in both the science side and the diplomacy side. And I hope that gives you a bit of an insight into the context. Asmeret, you probably have perspectives to add.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with how Megan characterized science diplomacy. I think it's easier for me to think about maybe thinking, broadly speaking, of course, science diplomacy operates at the intersection of international relations and scientific cooperation, right? And for me, it encompasses in particular maybe three different dimensions. One, we might there might be other kind of other purposes for why we're pursuing diplomacy, but scientific expertise can inform policy decisions in that respect, right? Or help strengthen diplomatic relations in pursuit of other goals that were other negotiations that may not necessarily, where science is not necessarily the central focus, right? But sometimes there is diplomacy also for science, right? Facilitating, for example, enabling facilitation of international scientific collaborations across borders, including negotiations so that we have agreements on how we can enable researchers to continue to work together, address shared challenges. And that, I think, is in its own dimension. And then the third dimension is what I think is probably easily categorized as science for diplomacy, right? Leveraging scientific cooperation that folks already might have or they could build and expand on as a bridge between nations that are having issues and challenges, particularly when we have strained political relations, where the first entry into kind of bridging those issues could be science diplomacy. So, as Megan stated, obviously, science diplomacy is a very kind of, you could say it's multi-layered. But generally speaking, I think it's very clear that there's a lot to be gained when we use scientific collaborations to build bridges between people, between nations, whenever we are able to use science to inform foreign policy, and whenever we can leverage, if you will, scientific evidence to advance societal goals or just specifically kind of scientific goals. In my personal experience, a lot of the work we did, in particular when I was in the federal government, a lot of it involved leading international partnerships and making it possible for scientists to be part of international partnerships to pursue joint research projects, including something like the International Mega Science Project, ITER, which is the fusion project that's in south of France, and is a partnership between 7 nations, including Russia and China, which in today's world, you can imagine not the easiest thing, but to make sure that that science project can continue regardless of what the geopolitics of our times might be. That involves a lot of diplomacy, as you can imagine. And so people from different backgrounds come together to work on it. Interestingly, I was the head of the US delegation for ITER when I was in my position. And another geoscientist was the head of was part of our delegation and was the head of the State Department team that was part of that US delegation. And so 2 US geoscientists, if you will, were representing the country in this, fairly complex, tricky situation, but to enable this mega science project. And as Megan also said, the other thing that I would underline is communication, right? Because so much about diplomacy is communication. So much about diplomacy is making sure that we arrive at the consensus that we can move forward together with, regardless of background disagreements that we might have, political positions that people might take, just for the sake of being able to move forward. How can we bring science into the mix to help us do so?
All right. Well, thank you so much. Ritvika, Andriana, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that was beautifully captured.
I agree. All right, so we're going to move into our second theme. You should be able to see it in the chat in a second. Recipe for having a diplomatic conversation. What sort of topic or features should individual mention in a diplomatic conversation? What should we avoid? We're going to start with Adriana, and then we have Megan.
So I'm going to start with a list and maybe give an example from that list that makes it a reality of what that list is comprising of. So diplomatic conversations. I was listening to both Megan and Asmeret on describing for us really very well what scientific diplomacy is. And I was thinking, well, I think actually I've been involved currently or previously. I got involved a lot into the policy making side, which means you infuse the science into the policy making, or vice versa, the policy into the science, and that was really exciting. And it involves a lot of negotiations and coming to an agreement and consensus. And now I find myself at the other side of the table where those agreements are already in place, which are the multilateral environment agreements, for example, which include the ones for climate change, the ones for biodiversity, the ones still in negotiation for plastic, for example. But at this fund, then I get to see the other side of implementation of those agreements. So I'm indeed very incredibly lucky to see both sides, and I don't have a favorite as yet. So back to my list. I think the very first thing, which is obvious, and I am no doubt seeing the panel and also seeing the audience and your questions prior to this, is that you need to know your science, and you need to know your science for a different audience. Nothing throws you that like being in the middle of your presentation and you have the delegation from another country challenge your position or give a contribution, and it then fuzzles you. But if you know your science and you know well and you understand your different audience, then most likely you can still pass that message across, even if there's a disagreement or input that you don't agree with. And the second one is really to know what your audience cares about. You have a small window of opportunity often in these diplomatic conversations, however they might be. And you would imagine a lot of the times when I'm talking about a diplomatic conversation, you're thinking of a nice conference room, you're coming, you have your PowerPoint, everything runs smoothly. No, actually, the diplomatic conversations can happen anywhere. I have been known to come out from the gym early in the morning, spot a certain minister also coming out from the gym, and try not to embarrass them, but also taking that opportunity to say hi. And I say, Minister, I noticed that you are looking at the emissions, methane emissions, in your statement. Would you be interested in, obviously it's an overstep, but it's a fine line between an overstep and, and harassment and getting your point across. So what I'm trying to say is that knowing your audience, of course, in this particular minister, I knew that I could pitch that because she's actually quite friendly and she kept referring to me as Madame UN, even if she didn't know my name. But anyway, know your audience. The third one is be intentional. If you're going to follow people as they come out of the gym and you have that window of opportunity for 3 minutes, you should already have thought in the morning what key message as they're putting together that resolution for the continent or global resolution or even smaller. It could be your town municipality. Know that your audience and understand what would put them at ease to have that discussion with you. And then sometimes it looks effortless. In fact, a lot of the times when you're doing diplomacy, it's supposed to look effortless, but sometimes it is years and years of research with multiple teams, multiple countries that is going into that effort. But in that moment of the 3 minutes, you need to be confident, look effortless. And I know that is a lot to ask. And I often say this is why a lot of women can wear high heels and do this, but I say that I can't actually think that fast, do all those things, be all those things and still in high heels. Kudos for the women that can do that. You need to follow through. You'll be asked for all kinds of questions in those avenues, in those conferences, in those rooms. And it will be as simple as send me a slide from your presentation. Or you spoke about this, can you share your paper? If you're lucky enough, don't we all want an audience for our science? So if you're asked that, then definitely follow through. Sometimes in these exchanges, they will give you a phone number or a WhatsApp or an email that doesn't exist. You're a researcher, you can still find them. So really follow through. And then last but not least, be open. Like I said, a lot of my breakthroughs in diplomacy were really accidental, but it looks accidental, but it's also the preparation that went beforehand. And in this one, I'll close with just a quick story about a ministerial conference for environment that is convened in Africa, and it covers all spheres of the environment, including the ones that I've just mentioned for Jeff. And I remember I was on the bus to the hotel and there were delegates from various countries. And we did this statement on climate change and air pollution assessment that was done by over 100 scientists. And this assessment was the first one that was done to that level for the continent. And we needed to get it in the statement of the ministers so that the environment ministers bring it to the floor. And that way scientific funding resources can be directed towards the art sciences community at the very least on the continent. Or at least that was my ambition as I was thinking, why think small? Think big. So my opportunity came through the delegates. We're looking for a hotel and they realized the hotel had been canceled. And do you know what I did at that moment? I took out my phone, got on the app and looked for hotels together with them. And the next day, when I needed my statement to go through, because as a scientist, because you're not a member of the delegation, some of you panelists have been as members of delegation, but as scientists, you're always often the one sitting at the back, passing on notes and information. But I needed this statement to come through. And guess what? Those delegates came through. They said, oh, but you're here. What is your statement? What is your interest? And they were able to put that on the floor, and that actually became a resolution. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Megan.
I have to say, I can only agree with everything that's been said so far. And now I have the hard job of thinking about what I would add. So everything that has already been said goes without saying. A diplomatic conversation is ultimately a conversation. And so to take it back to first principles of conversation, it's quite important to have an interest, which is very similar to Andriana saying, you need to know your stuff, but you also need to care about what the person you are having a conversation with cares about. And I mean, really, not just for the sake of having their attention for the purpose of 3 minutes outside the gym. You have to have and find some kind of shared values, shared purpose, shared mission, or shared challenge. If you both have a problem that could be resolved by communicating a little bit better, that's also a good enough reason to have a conversation. So I think that not just knowing, but also, I guess, listening and seeking to find that commonality is a really important part of not just diplomacy, but actually all science policy kind of engagement, really, because science is just this one piece of a puzzle that has so many other pieces that are intertwined. I also think in diplomatic conversations, it's important to think about how you present yourself. And I don't just mean physically, but for example, when we all introduced ourselves today, we did so with an affiliation, and maybe some of us with a country, and maybe also you can see maybe like backgrounds, or the context of where we're sitting, and all of those things will have allowed all of you, wherever you are watching or listening, or maybe even my accent has allowed you to make a judgment that is natural as a human being about who I am, where I come from, and what I have to say on a certain topic. And whether you like it or not, those biases exist in every type of human. And sometimes they're very effective at kind of furthering diplomacy, and sometimes they can work quite strongly against diplomacy. Because, say, I'm trying to have a discussion with someone at a COP, and I introduce that I'm from the Geological Society, and I'm, based in the UK, and the person I'm speaking to has no dealings with the UK whatsoever, they're already making a judgment about whether the thing I have to say is important or not before I've even got the chance to say it. So I don't bring this up because, I guess I want to flag that it's an irresolvable problem. But I think the more that you understand about the representation and presentation you bring to a conversation, and what biases that might allow other people to hold when you're having the conversation, the more power you have over the way that you engage with it. And the more you can choose how to present your messaging in a way that is powerful and punchy, and maybe works with those biases rather than against them. And I think that finding commonality is a really great way to overcome those. And commonality can be found in very strange places, especially outside of the gym, or in sort of strange kind of like shared interests, or it's a bit like making friends is being diplomatic, I think. And both are very challenging skills. I think, as well as knowing your stuff, knowing when to refer is a very important diplomatic skill. So knowing when you aren't the right person, the right expert, or the right organization, say you represent university or a fund or a specific research group, and you know that perhaps the diplomatic action you're trying to achieve maybe would be hindered rather than helped by the message coming from you. And again, that requires you knowing yourself and your own position in the world quite well. Then I think it's really important to be able to refer whoever's looking to engage in diplomacy to the right vehicle for that message. And a good example of when that has happened, I think, in my line of work is when, for example, the European Commission or anybody kind of in the European Parliament comes to us for scientific advice. Now, technically, we only represent the UK. And so there are European bodies out there who have memberships that are much broader than ours. And if that organization is looking for UK specific scientific advice, then great, happy to continue engaging with them. However, if they're looking for European advice from a range of European countries, then we are not the right body to do so. And so the best thing you can do to maintain trust and continue to develop the potential to continue to engage in diplomacy is to decline, I guess, the opportunity to engage in that instance, and refer or direct that person to the right and best place for that. And the very last thing that I think maybe is useful to consider is science undiplomacy, or science lack of diplomacy. What happens if you don't engage in science diplomacy, which I don't think there's a word for, science apathy, which is, it sounds like there's so much to consider, and maybe too much to consider, especially if this is the first time you're coming to a topic like this. You don't have to get it all right the first time. You can make lots of mistakes and still be intentionally very diplomatic. It's a learning process, and you can only learn by doing. And I think it's really important, as well as to consider all of these things like your position and your messaging and your presentation, what happens if you don't, and what is missing from the diplomatic system by you as an individual with potential and passion and expertise by not getting involved. And I think that is hopefully motivating in the face of quite a lot of other things to think about.
All right, a lot to reflect from both panelists. Asmeret, Rodrigo, would you like to add anything? Asmeret, I see you're nodding.
No, I was just agreeing with what they said. I don't think there's much new we would add. Thanks.
Yeah, that was great with a lot of information. All right, we're gonna move into more hard team. Team number 3, and bear with me, this is a long and a hard topic. Dealing with denial of science and communicating the importance of science to policymakers who may not see the value of science is incredibly challenging. What is the best way to approach and deal with the situation? Ritvika, are you okay to start us with this team?
Yeah.
All right.
Sure. So I'll come at this question from a kind of my own personal career journey and sort of my experiences, but I think there's lots of ways you can deal with this. But I think there's 2 kind of main things to think about. So I think the first one is, what do we mean by denial? And that, in this context could be an outright denial of science or evidence, but it could also be about prioritization. So the person you're trying to convince, it might not be their priority. Their priority is something else. And I think that's helpful to keep in mind because, at least in my career journey, and particularly when working in policy and trying to put forward evidence-based policy pathways, I think there's been 2 big challenges when it comes to convincing policymakers of a particular policy option. The first one is I think it's really about what we might see as the biggest value as scientists may not be of the biggest value in the context of the political context you're operating in, the advice you're giving. So I think the first thing to do is to obviously come up with your kind of policy option or negotiation position based on science, and then to think about what is the value add of that. So, for example, if you're developing a, like a sustainability policy about wind farms, maybe the value add of that is economic growth, better productivity. Maybe it's, support for the local community, better working conditions, and trying to identify which of those might land with the person you're trying to convince. So sometimes actually it's easier to convince on those value adds rather than, what you yourself see as the biggest value of something. And it's really hard, and it's a bit of a balancing game, but governments will all have their own priorities that they're trying to meet. So if you are able to showcase your evidence-based policy option in the context of that policy goal of that government, that often helps you get something across, even if the underlying science and evidence is not what it's getting across. That overall context of what you're trying to do might help. The second thing is the time scale. So I think, as I mentioned in my intro, I do think as scientists, we think in really long-term timescales. I think that's why we are actually, really passionate about the science diplomacy that we do. And we think in these long-term, 2050, 2070, 2100. But that's not the norm. If you go and speak to people, really, it's a very small percentage of the planet that is thinking about things in that time scale, and people have much more immediate needs that they have to fill. So I think when you're trying to convince policymakers, another thing to just step back and look at is the time scale of what you're trying to do. So if it's particularly, you're trying to convince them of a policy option that is a long-term issue or evidence that's a long-term issue, then what are the kind of shorter-term things that you can really pull out? And actually showcasing these different timescales can sometimes help sort of break the barrier of why is this important to me now? Like, why should I worry about this now rather than in 10 years' time? But that's also not to kind of downplay the difficulties we have in terms of just showcasing science and showcasing evidence. And I think it's sometimes important to remember that even if you try different approaches, it might not work. But the important thing is to keep trying and finding new ways of communicating, because it is a little bit kind of linking back to that first couple of conversations we had, that sometimes it's just about finding common ground. With the most unlikeliest people, with people you never thought you'd find common ground with, it is about finding that to be able to convince them.
Thank you so much. Asmeret, would you like to add additional information?
Yeah, I think Rika did a great job in highlighting important aspects of this. So one thing I would say is, I think it's really, really important that we diagnose why there is science denial in the first place, what people were trying to engage with, right? Because oftentimes, science denial might actually be rooted in other things. It might be, like Rika stated, that there's fear of economic or sometimes even political implications. Maybe the solutions we're proposing, there's a fear that they can put folks at kind of economic disadvantage. Or there's a kind of fundamental disagreement on politics and things that could be an underlying concern why people don't want to give science a chance, right? Or one that we don't necessarily talk often in the science community, I mean, not in ESWN, we are pretty open about this, but is the other thing to remember is that a lot of science denial is very likely rooted in people feeling like they're excluded from the system of science. If they don't see science as helping them, especially when there is resentment from people from one side who see others benefiting from science, one segment of society benefiting from science, while others are not benefiting at all, might even be disadvantaged by science, right? This is a very tricky and a delicate issue that is rooted in a lot of exclusionary history of science in itself, which I think is very, very important to remember when we're engaging, in particular with communities who are on the other side of that exclusion. Because even if we are members of a community that is historically excluded from science, by the virtue of us actually being part of science and speaking about science, right, we're not necessarily we're not personally feeling the damage of that, right? So I think it's important to empathize and understand where people might be coming from in this perspective. And then there's a few other things that I think are critical to add. One is we have to lead in whatever we're trying to, especially when we're trying to engage in a diplomatic setting, even other kind of communications, we really have to find a personal connection with people as humans first. Right. And it might actually be people we don't expect to have much of a connection with. But sometimes you never know what that connection might be. Right. So the climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe talks a lot about how she leads with discussions about her faith, in particular to right-leaning folks in the US when she talks to them about climate science. And it might seem weird for a scientist to be leaning with religious connections, seeking religious connections with people who are denying science. But the way she explains that I actually really like, and that her approach is that she has to relate to these people as humans first. Because if she can't do that, whatever science message she's trying to send their way is immediately dismissed. It doesn't ever get a chance. So she has to bring that part of herself, which for her is through that she's a religious person. She connects with them on that level. And more often than not, that helps her find an audience with people who are now willing to hear her on her interpretation of the science, not necessarily the science voice, but Katharine Hayhoe's voice in the scientific community. And that's very important, right? And it's also important that we're connecting with people, it's pretty common that we come from a world where we talk to each other about jargon and units, scientific units, and this and that. And sometimes we actually have to get out of our way, right? And what is important is not necessarily that, but rather it is, why do we care about these things? Like, why should somebody else care about these units or measurements? Emphasizing something along the lines of risk management, if that's relevant for the conversation. And kind of getting an agreement around how science might help us reduce uncertainty so that we can make better decisions about X, Y, or Z. That would help get us a long way, as opposed to, concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere getting this many parts per million or whatever. It means nothing to a lot of people, right? And interestingly, it sometimes means nothing even to the people who are making science decisions, right? That's really critical to remember. And so, whatever we could do to emphasize commonalities in translate the impact to the things that folks that we're trying to find a connection with understand. See where we can find allies. It might be, in religion space. It might even sometimes be with business. It might be with whatever it is, wherever we can find allies to support us. And the thing that is probably most important is nothing's going to change overnight just because anybody said so, right? It takes time. It takes persistent presence and conversations to get messages across, and in the most respectful and engaging way that we could possibly have these conversations, even when people are denying, our life's work. And it might even be a personal insult when people deny your life's work. But if you're trying to find an agreement, it's important to just not lead with that, right?
Thank you so much. Do we have other panelists who would like to add anything? All right. Megan?
Yeah, I have
Go ahead.
one thought about when context maybe changes the approach to the denial. And, denial on an individual level is absolutely necessary to take on at an individual level. But when denial becomes institutional, when denial becomes organizational, and when denial becomes widespread on a scale or at a level of power that feels like you as an individual cannot contend with, then I think that there is a lot of power to be gained from organizing and meeting that imbalance of power and imbalance of kind of opinion with some evidence of the same scale. I'll give you an example. So, as an individual researcher, you may work on a very specific topic. I think, Rika, you said you had some experience in biomass, for example. So you might have done some research, maybe not you, or you might have been, reading some research where you've learned that a certain type of biomass approach has the potential to change our capacity to reduce our carbon emissions by 20%, for example. Now, that fact, in the face of someone who denies that climate change is a problem, is essentially useless. But on a personal level, you can find some common ground, maybe talk around the issues, and get to the point where at least they now understand that biomass is a thing, right? You might not get to the biomass is a 20% thing, but it's a thing. If you live or work in a country where the government doesn't agree that there is a need to engage in using biomass because climate change isn't a problem, or we don't need to employ techniques like that, then as an individual, having one conversation with one other person isn't going to change that government's opinion most of the time. But if you have a professional institution or body like the ESWN, or if you have a national society, or even just a research lab or a university press office, or any kind of protecting or kind of, I guess, organizing force that allows you to come together with people, collate evidence and information into messages that are much broader and that can come from perhaps a name or a brand that protects you as an individual. I think that's a really smart way to engage with denial at a very high level without putting yourself individually on the line at a time when that might feel particularly scary or threatening. And so I think there's power in groups, there's power in collecting, and there's not necessarily always value in trying to 1v100 a problem. And, common messages across big teams of scientists are much more likely to win attention than individualistic messaging that's linked to one person's particular experience.
Thank you so much. And this takes us directly into our next team. which is team number 4. How should individuals navigate challenging conversation? Ritvika, I have you as the panelist for this question, but we're more than happy to have additional panelists. Very, very hard question.
That is a really hard question, and I can't believe I'm the only one. So others will have to help. So I actually think a lot of the things that Megan you're saying kind of runs into this question. So I think it depends. So I had a look at the Miro board and all the questions you all submitted, and actually for this specific one on navigating conversations that are challenging, there was lots of different examples given, everything from sort of like a discussion around your job to sort of speaking about funding, and I think it is entirely context dependent, but you can come to a challenging conversation proactively, or it could also happen to you. So you might have to react in the moment. I think the key thing to always remember is that you always have more time than you think. So it's okay not to immediately react to a challenging conversation or a situation, and to take the time you need to actually process and come up with your potential option or what's useful to you. So that's particularly useful when something is happening to you, but also it could work in a diplomatic conversation where you're trying to convince somebody and they just don't want to be convinced. I think it's useful to just stop and sometimes just take a moment and take a breather and think about what is the actual problem that you're trying to solve. So taking away some of the emotion that can come up in a challenging conversation, which is of course really important, but sort of stepping back from that to see, maybe you can't solve everything. And again, this sort of harks back to what Megan was saying, maybe you can't convince them of everything, but you could convince them of one thing. And if you could, what is that one thing that is an immediate thing that you could achieve? And potentially achieving that one thing in a challenging conversation could lead to more productive conversations in the future. So I think the two things I've really learned from sort of having challenging conversations, and it is a bit of a trial and error, and I would really encourage people to just go out and have challenging conversation. It's really horrible, but it's the kind of only way to learn, because the way in which you approach people, or the sort of how you communicate, how you present, that's different for all of us. So what works for me may not work for you, and you kind of have to find your own way of navigating this. So I personally always try to kind of step back, take a moment, and kind of just come down to the root of what is the basic problem that I'm trying to solve in this conversation, and try and kind of build on that in a very factual manner. And for me, that's very helpful because it helps me kind of ground myself, brings me back to the present, takes away some of the kind of pressure of having to solve this big thing if I can kind of break it down into small things. But I think just kind of almost trial and error can help you understand what is the technique that works best for you. For example, I know colleagues for whom the technique that works best for them is actually going in and kind of just letting it all seep in, and kind of seeing the emotion in the moment and trusting their gut and just reacting in the moment. But I know if I did that, I may not always have the most the most optimum reaction to what I would have had I had time to think about it. So I honestly think there is no right answer of how you can navigate challenging conversations. I think it is a little bit up to you and the situation, but I would really recommend trying to not just step back, but also to see what issues the other person has, and almost putting them in your shoes. And that's come up quite a few times today, where you need to connect with people, and it might be people that you think you have nothing in common with, but if you understand where they're coming from, then you could bring something to the table that they might want or that they might agree with. So I think it's about finding that balance to help you almost give a carrot to the people that you're talking to. But I'm sure others will have much better answers than that.
Does any of our other panelists would like to take that? Yeah, sure. Asmeret.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I would also say, I think, even before you go into a conversation that you you think has a chance of being challenging. And most diplomatic exchanges tend to have that kind of element at some level, as long as there's political differences. A key part of it is preparing mentally, right? To prepare mentally to not let it get to you, because if you expect resistance, right? If you expect a challenge, if you expect to go into a conversation where it's going to be challenging, then you very likely will actually, you will figure out, conversations, arguments, statements, and responses that will help you just, kind of not be dismissive, not obviously not react emotionally as it's happening. If it's not a surprise, you won't react to it. So you'll just be able to stay more rational, stay true to your. I mean, we're all human, right? Challenges are tricky to navigate, especially if you did not expect them. So anything you could do to prepare yourself for the potential of things being challenging, especially at a tricky point, I think are really important, because sometimes challenging the speaker is not really about differences that we have about the science, or even misunderstanding, right? It's about power and politics, about putting people in a tricky position and undermining your position, especially in a tricky situation. So not giving in to that, being prepared to handle that itself is so, so important. And in other ways, I think the other thing I would say is this is when it becomes really, really even more important to build coalitions with anybody you could possibly build a coalition with around tricky topics, right? Because you can't, if you're isolated and you have to be the target of a lot of the challenging conversation, it's going to be tricky. But if you can bring in allies into the mix, if you can bring in voices that will help you, in particular voices that the folks challenging you might relate with, you're just going to have a much easier time. But I mean, this kind of challenging things can come up in all sorts of ways, right? Sometimes it's even where you don't expect it. And yeah, we could talk about some examples if that's helpful, but I don't want us to get to take too long.
And we're going to go into the breaker room and have a chance to talk about this thing, but we want to try to kind of finish with a more positive question. So our team of 5, how do you stay positive in an ever-changing and uncertain world? Ritvika, are you okay to start with that, or should we start with Andriana? You okay?
Yeah,
right.
yeah, I can kick us off.
And I'm gonna try to ask if we can be short. We want to be sure we have times for the breakout rooms. So if we can answer that question in short, go ahead.
Super quick. So for me, it's actually about just switching off from the work and the what I do, like 9 to 5, and kind of the diplomacy, and kind of it can be quite overwhelming. So actually switching off, spending time with people that I love, my family, spending time in my community recharges me. So when I come back, I'm ready to tackle the difficult things again. That's, I think, my biggest takeaway, because you need to come back to who you're doing this for and what you're doing it for. And for me, that's kind of my anchor.
Andriana?
Yes, I was thinking back to when I first graduated from my undergraduate degree, and I remember thinking at the time there were no jobs, there was a huge recession, and especially if you work in industry, huge recession translates to limited opportunities. And of course, being a foreigner in South Africa, studying there meant that even slimmer opportunities. So not to take away from what's happening now, because even having that history, I still feel whatever is happening now, it's more accelerated, it's bigger, it's noisier, it seems insurmountable at times. But for me, it's what I do remember is to stay grounded, to remember what motivates me. Like I said, throughout my life, and I look at that very diverse portfolio career, I already see that research is a common theme, and that gives me joy. Infusing joy. I took on a mentoring session, an executive mentoring session a few months ago, and the coach actually mentioned to me that he thought I was a very serious person. And then I thought, has he met me? I am serious, yes. But there's the other side of me, the joyful, fun side. And I realized I'd not given him an opportunity to see that side. And then he actually made it known to me that I had the work I had undertaken had made me look so serious and so unjoyful. And so his prescription was to find joy, infuse joy, because I realized maybe I was waiting for the weekend to feel joyful about gardening or walking or meeting with family or friends. But meanwhile, actually, the work we do, because it occupies most of our time, you need to find a way to infuse joy in it day to day instead of waiting for that weekend opportunity or that holiday opportunity or that conference opportunity. And then I give myself permission to tune out the noise sometimes. And I'll give you an example. The noise is all over, it's all around us. Social media, all the different networks are going at you at different times. The algorithms learns what you're starting to look at, and then it brings more and more, and not always in a positive way. So for me, I give myself time to tune out and just say enough. I don't wanna deal with that. I'll deal with that tomorrow. And I guess like Ritika said, with family, with friends, you re-energize and you come back at it. But last but not least, giving back for me is really important. It grounds me, it brings me joy, and it combines all those different elements I've mentioned. Giving back can be in any way. It can be through your neighbor, through your family, through your community, through your networks. And all of us belong to these different networks, and you have those avenues. I'll pause here. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Asmeret, Megan, would you like to add like a one last sentence on this topic? Asmeret, I see
Yeah,
you're
I think
unmuted. Go ahead.
yeah, I would just say that joy is the theme that I would probably continue on. Joy as resistance, joy when things get challenging. Finding that in whatever way you can has so many good benefits. So whatever you find it, keep finding joy when things get challenging, especially, which is not an easy thing, but super important to recharge. Right?
I think it's, for me, the joy comes when you lead with curiosity. And maybe that's because of my sort of scientific training or just because of the way my brain works. But even in a challenging conversation or a challenging environment, or if something's quite affronting, shocking, fearful, if I prioritize being curious about why all of those things are the way they are, rather than judge them for being so, then I find that becoming positive through understanding is a lot easier. So that's what I'd recommend.
We're finishing in a positive tune. I love it. We want to thank our panelists, to Asmeret, to Megan, to Adriana, and Ritvika. This was wonderful. I know I learned a lot.